I'm 29 million, the youngest in my family. Growing up, my parents owned a modest but beautiful house that my siblings and I called home for nearly 2 decades. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had charm. A big oak tree in the backyard where we'd climb as kids, the worn-out kitchen table where we'd have family dinners, and my dad's workshop in the garage. It was a place I always thought would be part of our lives. When I was 22, my dad lost his job, and things got tough financially. I was in college at the time, working part-time to cover my expenses, but I couldn't do much to help. My siblings, Sarah, 33F, and Jake, 35M, were both married with stable jobs, so I assumed they were helping out. My parents never really asked me for anything, so I didn't realize how bad things had gotten. Fast forward to a few years later, I was finally finishing grad school and ready to come home for a while to figure out my next steps. That's when the first bombshell dropped. I called my mom one afternoon to let her know I'd be visiting, and her response was odd. "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you're coming home, but, we don't live there anymore." "What do you mean you don't live there?" I asked, confused. "Well," she hesitated, "we sold the house a few years ago. It just wasn't practical to keep it." I was stunned. "You sold the house? The house I grew up in? Why didn't you tell me?" She brushed it off, saying they didn't want to worry me while I was in school. They'd moved into a smaller place, and that was that. I felt blindsided, but decided to let it go. I figured they were just trying to do what was best for themselves. But things didn't add up. When I came to visit their new place, I realized they weren't exactly living modestly. The house was far nicer than the one they'd sold, complete with a pool and a new car in the driveway. When I asked how they afforded it, my mom got defensive. "Your dad's been working again, and we made a good profit from the old house." It still didn't sit right with me, but I didn't push it. A few months later, the second bombshell dropped. I was out for drinks with Sarah and Jake when the topic of the house sale came up. I mentioned how strange it was that our parents didn't tell me they sold it, and Sarah looked guilty. "Oh, you don't know, do you?" "Know what?" I asked. Jake sighed and said, "They didn't just sell the house. They used the money to bail Sarah and me out of some financial trouble. Apparently, Jake had racked up serious gambling debts, and Sarah's business had failed, leaving her with massive loans. My parents sold the house to pay off their debts, and whatever was left went into their new, fancy home. I couldn't believe it. So, the place that was supposed to be our family's legacy, the place Grandma and Grandpa left to Dad, they just sold it to fix your mistakes." Jake shrugged and said, "It's not like you were going to buy it." That night I confronted my parents. My mom admitted everything. "We didn't want to burden you with this," she said. "Your siblings were in trouble and we had to help. You don't understand how hard it is to see your kids struggle." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, their mistakes were more important than my memories, than the one thing that tied us all together as a family? My dad tried to justify it. "You're the responsible one. We knew you'd be fine without it. You've always been independent." It felt like a slap in the face. My whole life, I'd been the one who didn't ask for help, who worked hard to take care of myself. And this was my reward? To watch the family home disappear because my siblings couldn't get their act together. But the final twist came last week. I was visiting my parents for a holiday dinner, trying to put the past behind me, when Jake pulled me aside. "Hey, man," he said, "I was wondering if you could help me out. I'm in a tight spot again, and I know you're doing pretty well for yourself." I stared at him in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me." He shrugged. "Come on. You don't want to be the selfish one, do you? We're family," I snapped. "Family? You mean the same family that sold my childhood home to fix your mess? The same family that didn't even have the decency to tell me about it? No, Jake. I'm done. I walked out and haven't spoken to any of them since. My parents and siblings have been blowing up my phone, calling me dramatic and selfish. They're even trying to guilt me, saying I'm tearing the family apart. But for once, I'm putting myself first. Am I wrong for finally walking away? Or am I justified in cutting them off after everything they've done?"